Let me tell you something most people understand too late. When a deeply loving person goes quiet, that silence is not nothing. It is not a pause. It is not a trick. It is the sound of someone finally putting down a weight they were never meant to carry alone. And for the person who kept pulling away, kept hiding behind space, kept acting calm while their heart stayed restless, that silence can hit like a door closing inside the chest. At first, they may look fine, maybe even better than fine, relaxed, normal, unbothered, but do not miss what is happening underneath. Because when the messages stop, when the emotional rescue stops, when the soft place they used to land on is suddenly gone, something changes fast. The room does not become empty, it becomes real. And reality is loud when you have been using distance to avoid your own feelings. Stay with me, because this is where it gets deep. What looks like peace on the outside can become chaos on the inside. Not because the love was weak, but because one person finally stopped doing the work of two. And when that happens, the one who thought distance kept them safe often meets the very pain they spent years trying to escape. That is where the real story begins, not in the chasing, not in the arguing, in the silence after one heart decides it will not bleed just to keep a connection alive. In so many relationships, one person loves openly while the other survives by stepping back the moment things get too close. One brings warmth, one brings space, one speaks, one shuts down, one keeps trying to understand what is happening while the other keeps trying not to feel too much. In the beginning, this can almost look balanced. It can even feel mysterious, intense, addictive. The loving person thinks, if I just give a little more patience, a little more softness, a little more understanding, maybe this will finally feel safe for both of us. And the distant person thinks, if I just keep enough room around me, I can stay connected without feeling trapped. But over time, the pattern stops feeling romantic and starts feeling painful. The loving person gives more grace, more time, more emotional effort. The distant person takes more space, goes quiet more often, disappears longer, and calls it needing time to think. What they usually do not notice is the relationship is not surviving because distance works. It is surviving because someone keeps returning with love. That steady heart becomes the bridge, the cushion, the oxygen in the room. It holds the tension together. It smooths the rough edges. It carries what the other person will not face. And the moment that loving heart gets tired and falls silent, the hidden imbalance is exposed. This is not always dramatic, no screaming, no big scene. Sometimes it begins with a heavy stillness that says, I cannot do this alone anymore. And if you have ever lived through that, then you know how loud that kind of quiet can be. The distant person often believes they are managing the connection by staying guarded, but many times they are not managing love. They are managing discomfort. They are escaping emotion. They are avoiding the places inside themselves that feel messy, needy, scared, or unsure. And the reason they can keep doing that for so long is simple. Someone else keeps absorbing the impact. Someone else keeps softening the coldness. Someone else keeps making room for the confusion, the mixed signals, the long pauses, the dry replies, the sudden shutdowns, the disappearing acts that always come dressed up as needing space. The loving person does not just give affection. They give emotional structure. They calm storms nobody else can see. They forgive delays. They read between short lines. They hold hope together with tired hands. After a while, that becomes normal to the distant person. They start assuming the bond will always be there. No matter how often they pull away, the connection seems to survive. No matter how cold they become, someone keeps bringing warmth back to the room. They mistake loyalty for permanence. They confuse patience with endless supply. And this is why the silence shocks them later, because they never imagined the source of warmth would stop flowing. They thought there would always be another message, another opening, another explanation, another soft return. But when that finally ends, the emptiness they kept covered with borrowed comfort starts rising fast. Watch closely here, because this is where the mask begins to crack. Not all at once. First as restlessness, then as heaviness, then as a quiet panic they do not know how to name. At first, they may barely react. They tell themselves the quiet is temporary, just a mood, just a phase, just a little distance before the old pattern starts again. They expect the usual cycle, the reach out, the check-in, the emotional repair. The loving person has always come back before, so why would this time be different? But the quiet stays, and that is when something unstable starts moving through them. It may be subtle in the beginning, They check their phone more often. They feel strange at night. They cannot settle the way they used to. The distractions do not work as well. The silence feels different now, not chosen, not protective, not controlled, unanswered, and that is what makes it sharp. For the first time, they are inside the same uncertainty they once handed to someone else again and again. The mind hates that feeling. The heart hates it even more. This is where the inner collapse often starts, quietly, invisibly, behind a composed face and a normal routine. A person begins to feel the full cost of what their detachment was doing all along. Many emotionally distant people build their identity around one belief. If I stay guarded, I stay safe. If I pull back, I stay in control. If I do not need too much, I cannot be hurt too much. That belief can look strong, but strength built only on shutting down is fragile. It works only while someone else keeps bringing life to the bond. Once that warmth disappears, distance stops feeling like power and starts feeling like isolation. And this is the part nobody sees coming until it is already happening. The same silence that once gave them relief now feels like a locked room with no air moving through it. The loving person's patience is no longer softening the coldness. Their care is no longer filling the emotional gaps. Their reassurance is no longer calming the fear hiding in the background, and now the distant person is left alone with everything they kept pushing down. Fear of closeness, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being seen too clearly, fear of needing someone and then losing them. These feelings do not arrive gently, they rush in, and because they were delayed for so long, they often show up all at once. That is why the unraveling feels so confusing. They thought they were escaping pain. What they were really doing was delaying it, and delayed pain always comes back heavier. This matters more than most people admit. Silence is especially painful for someone who has used silence as a shield for years. For them, quiet was never just quiet. It was a hiding place, a way to calm panic without naming it, a way to avoid hard conversations, emotional exposure, deep honesty, and the risk of being truly known. Silence let them step back. Silence let them disappear into themselves. Silence let them keep love close enough to feel wanted, but far enough away to avoid surrender. And because the loving person kept filling that silence with grace, it looked like a successful strategy. The bond stayed alive, so the silence must have been fine. The other person kept trying, so the distance must not have hurt that much. But then comes the shift they never expect. The loving person becomes quiet too, not to play games, not to punish, not to teach a lesson. Out of exhaustion, out of truth, out of finally realizing that speaking into a wall is not connection. And that kind of silence lands differently. It does not beg. It does not explain itself 10 more times. It does not chase. It does not demand. It simply pulls its energy back. And in that moment, the distant person learns something painful. Their silence was never strong by itself. It only looked strong because somebody loving kept answering it with care. When the chasing stops, a whole false system breaks. Here is where it gets even deeper. So do not click away. The distant person was often more attached to being pursued than they understood, maybe not in a way they would admit out loud, maybe not even in a way they fully understood, but being pursued gave them emotional proof that they mattered. It let them feel chosen without fully showing up. It gave them reassurance without requiring full vulnerability. It quieted their fear for one more day, so when the pursuit ends, it does more than create space. It cracks the ego, because arguments can still feel like connection, tears can still feel like attachment, repeated explanations can still feel like investment. But peace is terrifying when you secretly depend on someone never walking away emotionally. Peace says the other person has accepted what you could not give. Peace says they are no longer trying to save the bond alone. Peace says the door did not slam, it closed with dignity, and that is much harder to fight with, harder to deny, harder to twist into one more temporary phase. Suddenly they feel something raw, not just loss, but the collapse of illusion. They were never as in control as they thought. Their power was borrowed from someone else's patience. Once that patience is gone, all that remains is the echo of everything they avoided. And now they are pushed into the one place they spent years trying not to enter, their own inner world. This is the battlefield they never wanted to walk into, because looking inward means meeting the younger fear under the polished adult distance. It means seeing the old wounds that taught them closeness was risky, softness was unstable, and vulnerability could end in pain. It means admitting that running was not always about needing space. Sometimes it was about not knowing how to stay, not knowing how to receive love without doubting it, not knowing how to trust kindness when life once trained them to brace for impact. As long as the loving person kept talking, forgiving, returning, and trying, there was always noise to hide behind. But silence removes the cover. No one is filling the room now. No one is translating their behavior into softer language. No one is making excuses for them anymore. And once that buffer disappears, truth starts pressing in from every side. Suddenly, the pain they caused becomes easier to see. Suddenly, the moments they avoided look different. Suddenly, the person who loved them seems clearer in memory than they ever looked in real time. That delayed clarity can be brutal, because now there is insight but no promise of access. This is why the collapse is usually not loud. It is rarely dramatic. It does not always show up as long texts or dramatic regret. More often, it shows up late at night, early in the morning, in quiet car rides, in random memories during ordinary days. They replay the thoughtful message they answered with one dry line, the deep conversation they escaped, the affection they treated like pressure, the reassurance they accepted but never returned, and little by little, the truth becomes impossible to outrun. Memory changes when loss enters the room. What once looked ordinary now looks rare. What once felt like pressure now looks like care. What once seemed available forever now feels painfully precious. And with that comes regret, real regret. Not just missing the person, but seeing the pattern clearly, seeing how fear kept cutting into love, seeing how distance kept winning over honesty, seeing how they slowly trained the other person to stop reaching. This is the part nobody tells them while they are still sure they can always come back later. Later is a dangerous illusion. Love can be deep and still grow tired. A good heart can stay loyal and still hit its limit. Once peace replaces pursuit, the old cycle has nowhere to return to. Then, something else starts happening in that silence. The stories they use to protect themselves begin to fall apart. They can no longer say nobody ever really cared. They can no longer pretend the bond meant little. They can no longer reduce the other person to being too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding, when the quiet now carries no pressure at all. There is nothing left to argue with, no drama to blame, no flood of emotion to call overwhelming, just absence, just space, just the hard truth that someone loved them deeply, tried again and again, and finally stopped because they could not survive the imbalance any longer. That truth is hard to escape. It exposes how much they were leaning on someone else's emotional labor. It shows that their independence was never as complete as they imagined. In many cases, they were leaning on patience while calling it too much, leaning on loyalty while giving only enough to keep the connection breathing, and when that support disappears, they feel the drop in full. This does not make them monsters, it makes them unhealed, but unhealed patterns still leave real scars, and when the consequences finally become impossible to deny, even the strongest defenses begin to break. The painful part is that many distant people do want love, deeply. They want safety, steadiness, a bond that feels real, but they do not always trust what they want. They want closeness, then panic when it gets near. They want understanding, then pull back when they feel seen too clearly. They want a safe connection, but when that connection asks them to stay open, they retreat into old habits. So when the loving person finally steps away from the emotional battlefield and chooses peace, the distant person is left with a terrible realization. The very thing they secretly needed was right in front of them, and fear kept making them turn away from it. That is why silence hurts more than conflict. Conflict can still be managed, delayed, argued with, blamed on timing, blamed on stress, blamed on anything convenient. Silence is harder. Silence sits still and lets truth speak. It says, this is what remains when excuses are gone. This is what your pattern built. This is what fear cost. And if the distant person has even a little self-awareness, that truth can shake them to the core, because now they are not just facing the loss of someone. They are facing the loss of someone who may have actually been safe for them, someone who might have stayed through their storms if they had learned how to stop running every time the weather changed. That is the part that can break something open inside them. The loving person's silence changes the mirror completely. Before, the distant person could see themselves through someone else's forgiveness, and that soft lens made everything easier to justify. A harsh withdrawal became needing space. A cold reply became stress. Emotional neglect became confusion. Mixed signals became complexity. But silence removes the soft filter. Now they begin to see the impact as it really was: the unanswered warmth, the blocked closeness, the repeated shutdowns, the small cuts made over time. And this is where shame can enter. Not the kind of guilt that leads to growth, but the heavy inner collapse that whispers, "I had something real and did not know how to hold it." If they are still emotionally immature, they may run from this feeling too. They may distract themselves, stay busy, chase attention, jump into another connection, pretend they are fine, but the deeper truth usually waits for them anyway. Because unresolved pain has a long memory, so does genuine love. Once they have felt the absence of someone who truly saw them, shallow replacements rarely bring peace. They may try to recreate the same comfort somewhere else, but what they miss is not just attention. It is the rare feeling of being loved with patience, gentleness, steadiness, and depth. That kind of loss does not fade simply because they avoid saying its name. And here is the twist that cuts the deepest. The collapse is not only about losing the loving person, it is about losing denial. As long as the cycle continued, they could keep believing their distance was wise, necessary, even protective. But once the warmth is gone, denial has nowhere left to hide. The pattern stands there in full light, and it is hard to look away. They begin to see that their silence did not protect love. It slowly drained it. Their shutdowns did not save them from heartbreak. They built the heartbreak piece by piece. Their distance did not preserve the bond. It weakened it. And once that understanding really lands, it changes the whole story inside them. Suddenly, the problem was not that love asked for too much. The problem was that fear kept rejecting what love needed in order to survive. That realization can feel like an internal earthquake, because now they must admit that intimacy was not the enemy, vulnerability was not the trap, being cared for was not the threat. The real threat was the old wound inside them that taught them to run from what might have healed them. If you have ever been on the receiving end of this pattern, you know how exhausting that truth is. And if you have ever been the one doing the running, you know how long it can take to face it honestly. But this is not only a story about pain. It is also a story about revelation, because the loving person's silence is not weakness. It is often the moment they stop abandoning themselves to keep someone else comfortable. It is the moment they choose self-respect over endless explanation. It is the moment they understand that love should not require self-erasure. And that shift matters, because when they stop filling every empty space with effort, they begin to reclaim their own energy. They see how much they were overworking the bond. They see how often they were translating, soothing, waiting, hoping, excusing, carrying. Their silence becomes clean, grounded, strong, not revenge, not bitterness, truth. And truth has a power that panic never will. This is why the quiet can feel so final to the one who ran. It is no longer emotional noise they can wait out. It is clarity. And clarity is hard to negotiate with once it arrives. So when the distant person starts unraveling after the loving person goes silent, it is not magic, it is not punishment, it is consequence meeting awareness. It is the nervous system finally feeling what it delayed. It is the heart recognizing what the ego kept minimizing. It is memory lighting up all the moments that were wasted. It is loneliness becoming impossible to dress up as freedom. It is the painful realization that being wanted by someone real was never a small thing. And for the loving person, this matters too. Their silence is not proof they did not care enough. In many cases, it is proof they cared until caring alone became unbearable. The quiet did not destroy the connection by itself. The quiet revealed what the connection had already become. That is why it hits so hard. It removes the fantasy. It shows who was carrying the bond, who kept avoiding the work, and what happens when one heart refuses to keep bleeding just to keep the story moving. And if there is one truth worth holding on to, it is this: real love does not fail because one person feels deeply. Real love breaks when fear keeps refusing the closeness it claims to want. Sit with that for a second, because once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. And that clarity can either change you or it can haunt you. Sometimes it does both before the lesson finally lands. Now let's go one step deeper, because this is where many people still get confused. Just because the distant person feels the collapse does not mean they are suddenly ready to love well. Feeling loss is not the same as learning from it. Missing someone is not the same as becoming safe for them. And regret, by itself, does not rebuild trust. Sometimes the silence wakes them up. Sometimes it makes them reflect, soften, even reach back out. But if they return without real inner work, they often bring the same pattern back with them, only now wrapped in better words. That is why the loving person must be careful not to mistake renewed interest for true change. Watch the actions, watch the consistency, watch whether they can stay present when things get emotional, watch whether they can speak plainly instead of disappearing, watch whether accountability shows up when discomfort arrives, because real change is not dramatic, it is steady, it is simple, it sounds like honesty, it looks like follow-through, it feels like safety over time, and if that is not there, then the silence was not the end of the lesson, it was only the beginning of seeing clearly. This part matters for anyone listening who keeps hoping the collapse alone will fix everything. It will not. Pain can open a door, but a person still has to walk through it. Awareness can shake the ego, but healing asks for more than a shaken ego. It asks for courage, humility, consistency, truth spoken out loud. Otherwise, the same cycle returns wearing a new face, and you deserve more than a recycled pattern that only sounds different for a week. For the loving person, the deeper lesson is just as powerful. Silence is not always loss. Sometimes it is rescue. Sometimes it is the first honest act of self-love after a long season of self-betrayal. Because there comes a point when staying available to someone who keeps withholding becomes a form of abandonment toward yourself. There comes a point when explaining more is not kindness, it is self-neglect. And there comes a point when letting go is the healthiest thing love can do. Not because the bond meant nothing, but because you finally understand your heart is not a waiting room for someone else's unhealed fear. If you are the one who loved deeply, hear this clearly. Their collapse does not mean you were supposed to stay longer. Their regret does not erase what the pattern did to you. Their sadness does not cancel your exhaustion. You are not cruel for becoming quiet. You are not cold for stepping back. You are not wrong for refusing to carry the whole emotional weight of a connection anymore. In fact, that may be the most loving thing you have done for yourself in a long time. And here is the part many people need to remember. Peace can feel unfamiliar when you have spent too long confusing emotional effort with emotional intimacy. But peace is not emptiness. Peace is what remains when you stop forcing what should have been mutual from the start. It may feel strange at first, even lonely, but it is clean. It lets you hear yourself again. It lets your nervous system rest. It lets your worth stop depending on whether someone is finally ready to choose you back. In the end, the silence teaches both people, but not in the same way. For the one who loved, it teaches that peace is not giving up. Sometimes peace is what love looks like when it stops begging to be met halfway. It teaches that caring deeply does not mean carrying endlessly. It teaches that boundaries are not cruelty, they are wisdom with a spine. For the one who ran, the silence teaches that distance can feel safe for a while, but it cannot build the connection the soul quietly longs for. Sooner or later, every avoided feeling returns, every postponed truth comes back, every unlived moment of tenderness becomes a memory with edges. That is why this kind of quiet becomes unforgettable, because inside that quiet, both people finally see clearly. One sees they must never carry love alone again. The other sees that fear cost them more than vulnerability ever would have. And once that truth settles in, nothing feels casual anymore. Not the missed chances, not the unanswered warmth, not the person who once stood there with open hands and a patient heart. The silence says what words could not say. The chase is over. The illusion is over. The borrowed comfort is over. Now there is only truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is where real change begins. So if this story feels personal, do not look away from it. Let it teach you. Let it sharpen your standards. Let it reveal where you still run and where you still overgive. Because the moment you finally see the pattern clearly is the moment you stop being controlled by it, and that may be the quiet turning point that changes everything.